Hello Algebra 1 students. Today we're going to take some time to talk about the methods that we have to solve quadratic equations. When we get to quiz time, I'm not going to tell you have to use one method or the other, although there's sometimes where one method will work and another one will not, and there's times where maybe a couple methods will work, but there's a method that's the best one to use or the easiest one to use. So we're just going to kind of recap what we talked about and then go over some scenarios where we pick the best method to use. So the first method we talked about in terms of solving was the square root method. And basically with this method, you can only use this method when there is no b value. If there's no b value, I would definitely use the square root method because it's pretty slick. You just have to isolate your variable, right? Take square roots of each side to solve for that variable. The next method we talked about was factoring to solve. Again, I would just use factoring when my x works. So if there is a b value, I would think, well, next I'm going to try factoring, and I'm going to see if my x works. If I can find two numbers that multiply to the top and add up to the bottom, if it works, then I would go ahead and proceed with factoring to solve. However, there's times when factoring does not work, and then you might have to use our third method that we talked about to solve quadratics, and that is the quadratic formula. I generally say use the quadratic formula when the x doesn't work. So I think I like to use factoring best, but again, it's up to you. Really, you can use the quadratic formula anytime. That's a nice thing about it. You could use it to solve any quadratic. However, we've seen it does take a little bit longer, right? And it's just a longer process. So that's why I like to generally say, well, if I can use factoring, I'm going to use factoring first. But if the x doesn't work, then I'm going to use the quadratic formula. Another reason why I would use the quadratic formula is, and this kind of goes back to when the x doesn't work, but when I have maybe decimals in my quadratic or large numbers, that would probably lead me to use the quadratic formula over trying factoring. But again, my thought process is I kind of go in order based on the ones we talked about. I first think, is there a b value? If there's no b value, I'll do square roots. If there is a b value, then I think, well, can I factor? So I just check to make sure see if my x works. If it works, I factor. If not, then my thought process is I go to quadratic formula. But again, you get to decide how you want to solve these quadratics. Sometimes there's multiple methods that work. And like I said, I've had some students that say, I really like quadratic formula. I'm going to use that every time, and that is just fine. That's up to you. Just knowing that the quadratic formula does take a little bit longer than some of those other methods. So let's go over a couple questions here where we decide what's the best method to use. It says, choose the method you would use to solve the following equations, justify your answers. Well, if I saw this first one, it's not asking us to solve, they're just asking us to pick which method. If I saw this one, I would be thinking square roots to solve, because how I justify that is there's no b value. Right, so it'd be pretty slick to solve. I would just add 9 to the other side. So I know it doesn't say to solve, but let's just do it real quick. I get 3x squared equals 9. I divide by 3. So I gotta get x squared equals 3. Take the square root of each side, so I get x equals a positive and negative square root of 3. Right, that was pretty quick. There's no b value, so it's set up really nicely for square roots. Again, you could use quadratic formula here. I think factoring would even work as well, but it just set up nice for square roots, so that's the method I would choose. This next one, for b. First off, again, I think, well, can I use square roots? No, because there's a b value. So next, I always think, well, factoring. So I'm just going to see if my x will work. Again, I look to see if there's a GCF I can pull out first, and there's not. So then I'm going to take a times c, 1 times negative 30. So I get negative 30 on the top, b on the bottom, which is a negative 1. So I got to think of two numbers that multiply to negative 30 but add up to a negative 1. Those two numbers are negative 6 and 5. So since the x works, that means I can go ahead and solve this quadratic using factoring because the x works. So that's the method I would use. Again, you could also use quadratic formula if you wanted to. That would work as well, but since factoring works, that's the one I would generally lean towards. Looking at this next one here, again, I'd be thinking, well, there's a b value, so I can't use square roots. So I'd be thinking, well, can I use factoring to solve? And one thing though for this one, I mean, you can definitely see if the x works, but if you notice a times c, that's going to be a pretty big number. And maybe, gosh, I just don't want to deal with big numbers, so maybe I would just lean towards quadratic formula here. And my reason might be just big numbers. I didn't even check to see if the x works. Maybe it does, maybe factoring works, but here I just see big numbers, so that kind of gears me towards quadratic formula. Last one here, again, same idea. There's a b value, so I can't use square roots. I'd be thinking, well, can I factor? These numbers are nice and small. There's no GCF to pull out right away, so I just take a times c, so 3. B goes on the bottom, which is a -5. And I'm thinking, gosh, can I find two numbers that multiply to 3 but add up to -5? And I can't, right? So that means my x doesn't work, so that means I have to solve using quadratic formula. Meaning my answers are probably not going to be very nice answers, right? I might get some crazy decimals for answers. That's why I can't use factoring to solve. I would have to use quadratic formula. Again, my reason here is x doesn't work. Again, just as a recap, you could use quadratic formula on all of these, but obviously I think factoring goes a little bit faster, so when I can factor, I'm going to factor. Or when there's no b value, I'm going to use square roots. But again, ultimately it is up to you. All right, just 3 more, and then I'm going to let you do some practice with choosing the best method for your homework. So again, it says choose the best method, or which method you would use, and justify your answer. So for A, again, I go through my checklist. Can't use square roots because there's a b value, so I'm next thinking, well, can I factor? So I'm going to check my x. A times c, so 1 times 12 is 12, b on the bottom, which is a -8. So I'm thinking, are there two numbers that multiply to 12 but add up to a -8? And there are, it's -6 and -2. So therefore, I would choose factoring to solve because my x works. So then I would just factor, right? And I believe when you factor this, just as a little review of factoring, right? We get x minus 6 after you made your box, x minus 2 is equal to 0. Then to find your solutions, remember you just set each factor equal to 0. So we'd say x minus 6 equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0. So it looks like x would equal 6, and x would equal 2. All right, that's how you could find your solutions by factoring. Just a quick review. Again, here I'm just looking for what one you choose and why. So factoring because the x works. On this next one here, well, if I wanted to, I could set it equal to 0. I'd have 169x squared minus 36 is equal to 0. And I would be thinking here, well, gosh, there's no b value, so I'm going to use square roots. Again, my reasoning, because there's no b value. Square roots. And last but not least, let's look at this last one. Again, there's a b value here, so we can't use square roots. So I'm thinking, can I factor to solve? So I'm going to go ahead and make my x, a, b, c, a times c for the top. So 5 times -1 gives me a -5, b on the bottom, which is 13. Can you think of two numbers that multiply to -5 but add up to 13? No, I can't. So that means our only option here is to use the quadratic formula. And again, my reasoning is because the x doesn't work. So we have to use quadratic formula. So again, just to recap, there are times when you can only use one method. Sometimes it might just be the quadratic formula. There's other times when you can use multiple methods. It's up to you to decide what the best method is to use. Sometimes it's what method you're most comfortable with in certain situations if there's options between two different methods. But that's kind of just what we're focusing on today, picking that best method to solve. So what I have for you as homework is on Classroom, I have a link, or I've made an assignment for, and it's you'll open a copy of a Google Doc, and on there I have 3 quadratics, and I'm under each quadratic it says which method would you use to solve. So you'll say either square roots, factoring, or quadratic formula. Then you have to explain underneath why you would use that method to solve. And I said using 2 complete sentences. So it's not enough to say, I'm choosing quadratic formula because I like it. That's not how it works. You'd have to say, I'm using quadratic formula because maybe the x doesn't work for factoring, or the numbers are really big, or something like that. Give me 2 nice sentences saying why you chose the method that you did. That's it for today's notes. So again, if you have any questions, as always, you can shoot me an email at storantflip@gmail.com. Please make sure you get that writing assignment done on Classroom. Thanks and have a great day.